Good evening. I'm Pam Thomas, the coordinator for the Northern Virginia NDC chapter of CHAD, and I want to welcome you to our May lecture, Healthy Screen Use in ADHD, Thinking Outside the Roblox, presented by Dr. Clifford Sussman. Many of you are familiar with CHAD and our chapter, but for those who are new to CHAD, let me first say welcome. Our chapter's mission aligns with CHAD National's mission, which is to improve the lives of children and adults who are affected by ADHD. Our chapter is a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support in a number of ways. One of the ways is to offer support to our ADHD by monthly lectures like this one here, offer support groups for parents and adults, and host an annual ADHD resource fair in October to highlight ADHD Awareness Month. And now to introduce our speaker. Clifford Sussman, MD, has been in private practice in psychiatry for children, adolescents, and young adults in Washington, D.C. since 2008. He is an expert on internet and video game addiction and whose pioneering work has been featured throughout the media. He has authored peer-reviewed literature, parent and student education, and clinician training on problematic screen use, assessment, and treatment. He is dedicated to helping people achieve a more balanced relationship with digital technology. We ask that you watching this wonderful lecture tonight, type all your questions into the chat, and one of our board members will present you your question to Dr. Sussman following his lecture. Thank you, Dr. Sussman, for sharing your expertise on this topic. Please take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And let me just make sure my slides are advancing. And here we go. So a little bit, she already gave you a lot about my background. She told you I'm a psychiatrist in private practice, and that internet and video game use problems are my specialty. A little bit about my background. I actually was a gamer myself. I still do game sometimes, and I still really like using technology, so I'm not going to tell you guys not to use it at all. I actually learned to code at one point and did some educational software development. So it kind of alerted me to just how attractive a screen can be and how hard it can be to get off of one. And it was when I went into practice, people would come into my office, parents would come in and say, my kid's addicted to video games. And maybe they had seen a couple other specialists, and those specialists had sort of said, well, you just got to treat their ADHD or whatever other problem they had, their anxiety or depression, and the screen use would get better. And lo and behold, it hadn't. So they wound up in my office, and I was seeing people with some really serious problems, with some real serious struggles, due to not being able to get off their video games. And sure enough, like when I did the evaluation and the assessment, I was finding the same types of problems I'd seen in my drug and alcohol addiction rotations. So it really, I really thought that, this was an unaddressed problem. I was confused about why we didn't get any training on it in our residency or fellowship program. And so I started reading a lot of peer-reviewed literature on the topic of too much screen use. And I would look at a lot of brain imaging studies and compare them to the brain imaging of people who use too much drugs and alcohol, and saw that there were a lot of similarities. So at some point, quite a bit before the pandemic, I decided that there was much more of a demand for help with this than there was supply of help in mental health. So I decided to really make it my focus so that I only take people in my practice who have that as part of the presenting complaints, that there's too much screen use. Of course, nowadays that doesn't eliminate too many kids. So and of course I work with young adults and younger children with screen problems. So really any age that has like a too much screen use problem. And I initially, even before the pandemic, I got a lot of people who were like first year college dropouts. And then during the pandemic, of course, like the number of patients that were trying to come into my practice skyrocketed, and after the pandemic. So that's when I started being overwhelmed by the flow of people who needed my help, and that's when I decided to spend a lot of time in the community doing psychoeducation and prevention, and a lot of time training other clinicians, which I still do quite often. You can find out more about me on my website at cliffordsussmanmd.com. But the best reason to go to that website is to go to the information section, and you'll see a lot more talks like this one, or articles, or other educational material that I put out there, including the peer-reviewed literature that I've written. So please visit my website and click on information if you want more information on this topic. So let's focus on ADHD for a minute, since this is Chad. And why do kids with ADHD spend more time on video games than the typical kid? I mean, I don't even think we have to argue that point, or dispute it. I think it's pretty evident, right? And there's actually reasons for it. Let's look at what's actually going on in the brain in ADHD. So if you take a look at a cross section of the brain, you can think of it as, I like to use the car analogy for the brain. The brain has kind of like a driver, and it has a set of brakes. The driver is the reward system of the brain, also known as the dopamine pathways, because they're nerves that carry the neurotransmitter dopamine. And that's represented by the green arrow. It starts in the center of the brain and it projects outwards. So in the center of our brain, we really have the thing driving us. Now, what do I mean by driving us? I mean that we tend to go after what gives us dopamine, right? So our actions are in the direction of what gives us more dopamine. And what gives us more dopamine is instant gratification, not having to wait for what we want. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but that's what will drive kids to do things, including acting impulsively. It was actually evolutionarily advantageous for all species to develop a reward system like this, where you want to get things fast. If you think about survival, a caveman maybe needed to act fast to catch their prey. But unfortunately, we live in a day and age where there's so many things we can get instantly, and so many sources of dopamine, that it's almost it almost works against us at times. But fortunately, human beings, unlike other species, have a braking system called the prefrontal cortex. Now, that's in the front of the brain here, and it's actually much larger in a human than any other species. So you're not going to see like most animals saying, "Oh, I can't eat that now because it's not dinner time yet," or I'm on a diet. Like animals think, like they see food, they eat it. They don't wait. Animals, they don't have breaks. If you watch animal behavior, whereas humans have a braking system. So like a human can say, "Hey, it's not dinner time yet. I'm going to eat later." And to do that, you need to apply your brakes. Right. And to control our impulses, we need to apply our brakes. So what's going on biologically in ADHD, which we know is a biological problem? It's a disordered prefrontal cortex, in a nutshell. I'm sure that I'm oversimplifying it a bit for teaching purposes, but the bottom line is that we know that people with ADHD have problems with their prefrontal cortex. And so imagine a car that just keeps driving without any brakes. There's going to be a lot of problems, a lot of impulsivity. You're going to have a lot of seeking of immediate gratification and continuous stimulation. Now, this is why we give kids with ADHD medications that give them stimulation, like methylphenidate, Ritalin, right? Because they're getting an outside source of stimulation from the drug. So they don't need to seek it from their environment as much. So that's kind of how these medications work. And what do these drugs do? Well, they actually boost dopamine levels in the brain, as you would expect, right? So you can also think of dopamine as the stimulation neurotransmitter. Okay, so um, and again, notice that I've called dopamine the stimulation neurotransmitter. I've called it the instant gratification neurotransmitter, but I haven't called it the pleasure neurotransmitter like a lot of people call it. And the reason I haven't called it that is because um, if your pleasure is delayed, right? It's not just about getting pleasure, because if that pleasure is delayed, you don't get as much dopamine, at least not until you actually get it. So it's more about the getting pleasure when you want it. It's dopamine's released when we get what we want when we want it, and it doesn't have to be pleasure. It can be anything we're anticipating getting, and even the anticipation itself can produce dopamine. Okay, so let's talk about some more things that draw our kids into video games, other than what I just told you, which is that our kids with ADHD are not really, and adults as well, they're not really locked into long-term gain. They don't really tolerate boredom well. And online, you don't have to do that. And our devices now, more so now than ever, are shortcut machines. They're designed to give us what we want when we want it, with an emphasis on the when we want it part. Because if you think about a cell phone, it's not as advanced as a PC, but people nowadays spend much more time on their cell phones, their smartphones, because they can just take them out of their pocket wherever they are, right? And you get what you want on it immediately. So the version of what you actually get doesn't have to be as good as the real life version. The key is that you're getting it quickly. And so I like to think of all the things that our kids do impulsively as them going after shortcuts. Um, another thing that stimulates our kids and keeps them stimulated long after they've gotten the initial gratification of getting on is something called variable ratio reinforcement, which is basically saying that you know, as a colleague of mine once said, that the internet is the world's biggest slot machine, as are all these digital devices, because they're designed to give us random content that's often unpredictable, much like a slot machine in Vegas. And slot machines are based on reward schedules that psychologists like Skinner figured out work on rats in the lab. So the people who build these apps on our phones, like Candy Crush, um, the people who design slot machines in Vegas, as well as ones online on your computer, or slot machine like games where you win sometimes, you lose sometimes. And the people who design even these little videos that kids will watch on YouTube Kids, showing hands opening chocolate eggs with random prizes inside that can glue like a 4-year-old to it for hours. The people who make this content, like, they're aware that of the concept of variable ratio reinforcement, even if not all of you have heard of it. They understand that if a kid gets a prize every time that's the same, they're going to lose interest. But if they sometimes don't get anything and occasionally get a prize, it's that randomness will keep them coming back, and will trigger a lot of dopamine release. Okay, so what else is it about video games? Well, ADHD, it's also known as um, not always just a problem. In some ways, kids with ADHD have some special gifts too. Like they often are very creative and can think outside the box. Um, Perhaps the lack of executive functioning sometimes allows them to go off the tracks a little bit to some good places, not just places they don't want to go. And it's been thought that a lot of historic geniuses probably had ADHD. Well, in any case, in real life, you have a place with limited reality, where you have to do a lot of boring routine tasks. And in the virtual world, you have boundless fantasy and creativity, right? With games like Genshin Impact, um, that take you into this fantasy world. Um, you can you can become an avatar that maybe is like you or that's completely like someone else. You can explore all these different worlds that are much more interesting and stimulating than the real world. Um, or they're similar to the real world, except again, you get everything quicker. And you can be completely immersed. You can have it on a virtual goggles. You can have a setup so that when you walk around, your avatar walks around. So you really, if you're bored in the real world, there's a great virtual world for that most kids with ADHD are going to pick over a real world, especially if that real world is becoming stressful to them, or if they're getting a lot of blows to their self-esteem in the real world because of their executive functioning difficulties. All right, so what else is it? That kind of leads me in perfectly to my next point, which is that kids with ADHD often feel inadequate, like they don't fit in with everybody else. They may fear missing out on the joke sometimes because they may not pick up on it the way other kids might. Um, maybe because they weren't paying attention, especially in larger group settings. So in the video game world, it's almost the opposite. Like the ADHD kids are the ones who may fit in the best, and they may be able to master things online that don't require that degree of executive function skills that mastery in real life has. And look, the other thing is that part of what defines ADHD are the social skill problems as well that come with maybe being more impulsive, or not having a good attention span. And what the virtual world does, what social media does now, is it levels the social playing field, right? Because a kid with ADHD may not pick up on all their nonverbal cues of a real life conversation. But when they're talking with their friends on Discord, which is like social media for gamers, they don't have to. And in fact, maybe, whereas in real life, there may be skills that the kid with ADHD may not have as much that rise you to the top of the social ladder. In video games, there's different criteria that rise you to the top of the social ladder. So it really levels the playing field a lot. And you could say the same thing about autism. And so really you go from a situation of not fitting in to fitting in great and sometimes being at the top. Again, that's when, sometimes thinking outside of the box is the thing that gets you more attention online and social media or in a game. And by the way, the line between social media and gaming, it just keeps becoming blurrier and blurrier because gaming is social now. A lot of the content that the players are playing are created by other gamers. So, that's another fact. That's another feature of ADHD is that these kids can tend to be more creative and now they can create their own content. So you can go into a world like Minecraft and you can master it enough that you can create games for other people to play in this world. So it's like most of the games that are really popular, like Roblox and Minecraft now, have almost all user generated content, and it's almost all social. Like it's all kids playing with each other from around the world or from their own neighborhood. So again, this is a real draw for somebody who's creative and for somebody who wants to make more friends and be more social. And maybe find socializing online a lot easier than socializing in the real world. And that's, the massive multiplayer online games that draw kids like this who want to socialize online, which you could argue is like another form of social media. Uh, games like Fortnite and older ones like World of Warcraft, uh, games like Rocket League, where you're this car driving around hitting a soccer ball. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with these games, but the point is that, these games are, you're gonna, they're more addictive, and when I get people in my practice, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, they're addicted to massive multiplayer online games, including, of course, like Minecraft and Roblox. Very seldom are they addicted to a game that I played growing up, like some adventure game, where it's more of a linear, one player experience. Although, I found that even those games could get you on forever just trying to beat them. But these games have endless mastery, they're open world, and they're very social. So you're not only staying on the game because of all the addictive factors, but you're staying on them because of the peer pressure. Because if you're playing with other kids, you don't want to let them down if you're on a mission with them. Okay, so this is more examples of like fitting in socially because you're a gamer, right? These are kids at a convention who are dressed up as Fortnite characters, so they can hide behind their costume, and maybe even act like their character. Okay, so as a result of all this, you get lots of kids with ADHD and kids without ADHD who are binging on screens, right? They're not just on for like half an hour, they're on for hours and hours and hours on end. Especially if they don't have structure, which we all know is so important for kids with ADHD. And I'm going to come back to that as well. Okay, so you get all this digital binging. And what happens? What are the consequences of digital binging? What are the effects that it has on our kids' brain? And so I'm going to show you theoretically what's going on when our kids are gaming for hours and hours and days on end. Okay, so if you were to zoom in on these blue dopamine pathways, what you actually have are many bundles of brain cells that look like this. They're long and skinny. Okay, and they're almost like electrical wires because the signal travels down one brain cell and goes to the next brain cell. That's really how our brain works. However, you'll notice there's tiny little gaps between the end of one brain cell and the next brain cell, and that gap is called the synapse. And it's very significant in psychiatry and medicine because in order for a signal to keep going, you have to have messages transmitted across this tiny little space. And that's where neurotransmitters work. So let's zoom in on that. And actually for this video I made, I picked like Pokemon characters because it's such a popular gaming thing for kids. And I was hoping that they could learn about their own brains this way if I made it appealing to them. So I have these Pikachus representing dopamine molecules. And this is the end of one brain cell, and this is the beginning of the next. So this would be the presynaptic neuron, the brain cell that's carrying the signal, and then the postsynaptic is where it's traveling to. So that's the next brain cell. So, and this gap in between is the synapse. And what the brain has to do to carry the signal through is to send dopamine molecules across the synapse into these little pokeballs, which represent receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic cell. And the receptors here are really the key to everything. So,
sorry to interrupt.
yeah, go ahead.
Are you trying to share some kind of video or other imagery, because we haven't been seeing any slides or any kind of imagery?
You're kidding me. You don't see my slides?
No.
Hey,
Oh, boy.
Pam, I can see the video.
Oh,
Yeah, I can see the video.
okay. So
Okay.
So maybe it's just
I
you.
apologize, of course.
I can see the
Can-
video
can
too.
people put in their comments if they can't see
Okay.
it?
Okay, maybe we should ask if anybody cannot see the videos.
Yeah,
and
that's
maybe
what I mean. If
Pam-
they can't,
Pam, you
cannot.
can
That's
figure
what
out why you're not seeing the video that all of the rest of us are able to see, and you can share that with the other people who may not
Okay.
be able to see
All
it.
right, all right, thank you.
Yeah, this might be a little tough to follow without the video. You'd have to be, especially if you might have ADHD yourself. I don't know. I mean, I personally have trouble listening to audio without video too. So, but anyway, thanks for checking on that. So okay, so you have dopamine molecules traveling across the synapse into the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. And then when that happens, the signal is able to continue down the postsynaptic neuron. The receptors are specially designed to catch these dopamine molecules. All right. So if at baseline, there's always some dopamine crossing the synapse, right? So let's say this is your kid with ADHD at baseline, and so he's just like coming home from school, okay, and there's a little bit of activity, okay, in his dopamine pathways, his reward pathways. Now he starts playing video games. So again, he's getting what he wants when he wants it now, and all of a sudden there's a lot of dopamine flow. So you have lots of little Pikachus going into Pokeballs, lots of receptors. And as sorry, I went to the next slide. Okay. So I kind of spoiled the ending, but so what happens as a result of this is that the receptors, the number of receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic cell drops. And that's really what's going on when you get tolerance or when you get desensitized to something. You still have plenty of dopamine, after hours and days of use. You're still getting dopamine from the game. Games never fail to do that. But what they don't, but what happens is now you have fewer receptors. So now that you have fewer dopamine receptors, you're not going to get the same amount of pleasure or stimulation out of the same amount of dopamine. And that's kind of how the brain maintains homeostasis, how it saves energy. And so now you can see that he's been on this game for hours and hours and days, and now he's not as interested in it anymore. And maybe now he's staying on to prevent what happens when he stops, which is that you get a condition known as withdrawal, where now you have less dopamine because you stop playing the game, but now you still have less receptors. And you'd have to be in the state for quite a while before you get your receptors back, maybe days or even longer. And so he's in a very bad spot right now. And I bet a lot of people listening to me today have seen their kids in this state, like where they get off a video game and they go into their form of withdrawal, which may be irritability, it may be aggression in some extreme cases. It may be just extreme boredom. And it's also been talked about in the literature as a condition called reward deficiency syndrome. So digital binging actually leads to more boredom, which is a vicious cycle. And then when there's more boredom, there's more reward seeking, and in turn, you have more binging. And so that's when you really have trouble. And that's when you can start to have problems from this, because you just can't get off no matter how much it's taking priority over your life. Okay, so there's another phenomenon I see a lot where, and you see it in all of addiction medicine, where people will substitute one form of dopamine for another. If for example, you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, you may see people outside on the steps who are vaping or on their screens, on their phones, right? So it's almost like they stop getting one source of dopamine, because dopamine is really the final common pathway of any addiction, and they traded it with another. And that, to me, that's very similar to when you have a kid who's told to get off their computer by their parent, let's say, and they get into bed, and then they take out a phone that's next to the bed and they start watching the same video game, except other people are playing it, and now they're watching it on a streaming video. So they lost one source of dopamine and they substituted another. And keep this in mind because a lot of people ask me questions about, what's the worst thing for them to be on? Is this game more addictive than that game? Or are games more addictive than videos or videos more addictive than games? Really, like what it comes down to is kids will substitute one source of dopamine for another. So it's really helpful to kind of understand what sorts of activities are higher in dopamine, and we'll talk about that. And by the way, if all this is going on in the brain, why am I not here talking to you all about the virtues of abstinence, right? Because if we were talking about cocaine addiction, of course we'd be focused on abstinence and not using it all, right? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. The most prominent being that one, we're functionally dependent on technology in our society. And so these kids are going to get exposed. They're not going to be able to stay out of the bar, so to speak, completely. You know, and so so I like to look at it as, is there actually some advantages to having to learn to do things in moderation? And that's very much a reaction to this idea that doing something in a reduced amount, doing something in moderation is called harm reduction, right? As if you're doing less of something harmful, right? And it's making it not as bad, but still pretty bad. I don't like that. I don't like to think of it as harm reduction to learn to do something in moderation, because I actually think there's benefits to learning to do something in moderation. And especially for kids with ADHD, because there's two skills that kids with ADHD need in life that they struggle with a lot. And one is delayed gratification, and the other is using the brakes of their brain. Of course, so these are both prefrontal cortex activities, right? So what I'm really talking about is like waiting to get on the game until you finish your homework, or taking a break when you've been on for an hour. Both of those things are very difficult for our kids to do. However, if you think of the brain as kind of like a muscle that you can train and you can get better at, and you can form new connections by repeating something over and over again, these are skills that I figure if kids with ADHD get better at, it will help them in the rest of life. So hence you have this model, which of finding balance, which I don't really like to call harm reduction. Instead, I like to look at it as balancing high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity, right? So high dopamine activities I define as activities that are always instantly gratifying and constantly stimulating and give you that dopamine all the time, such as video games and social media and streaming videos. And low dopamine activity is activities that require more patience, the activities that you have to wait for. And so my model of healthy use is to try to figure out how to balance the two, which may look different for different kids and different families, but that's the general objective. So a lot of parents will look at a kid's screen problem as how productive are they? Are they getting their work done? And I don't like that model. I like to look at it as, not how productive they are, but because you can do low dopamine activities that are not technically productive. I like to look at it as how balanced they are, right? Because, so it's not just about making sure they're getting their homework done. It's also about, what other low dopamine activities do they have? And then for parents, the goal is also about finding balance, because for parents, you often see them go to one extreme or another. So the one extreme of dealing with this could be just giving up and letting the kid use the screen all they want, which one could call enabling, right? And the other extreme, which is like not letting the kids use the screen at all, is called micromanaging. And so I think for parents, the challenge is to find a balance between the two, and between letting your kids self-regulate and learn to self-regulate, building those skills. And also on the other side, setting some limits and making sure that they're experiencing natural consequences that give them incentive to set their own limits. And so this is quite a challenge for parents, and it's always a balancing act. It kind of never ends. But I find parents tend to be more successful if they stay in the middle of these two and don't go to one extreme or the other. And actually, with this model, if you think about as a kid gets older, from like when they're young to when they're older and more mature in their teenage years, and I would say the prefrontal cortex is developing even throughout your 20s. So the parenting model can shift from more limit setting to the left side of this, which is more self-regulation as your kid gets older. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what parents can do to set these limits. So for one thing, we know that kids with ADHD need a lot of structure, right? And that's why one of the reasons things got so bad during the pandemic. So it's so important to get your kids involved in things like sports after school and weekend activities, weekends being the most unstructured time. And that's when I say structure, I'm not talking about, okay, you have homework to do. That's not really structure. Structure is, okay, you have to be at this place from a certain time to a certain time. And you do that this time every week, let's say, and you meet other people there. Like if you get your kid going to play soccer every Saturday, for example, and they're playing soccer for 3 hours, that's 3 hours you're not having power struggles with them about being on their screen. At least unless you let them take a phone to the game. But the point is that it makes a parent's life much easier in addition to being better for the kid. Okay, and then another thing that's really important for parents is to manage the cues in the home environment. Now, what am I talking about with cues? So when somebody with, like, let's say, let's go back to the analogy of alcohol use. Like when someone with alcohol use disorder goes in, and use disorder, by the way, is the new fancy clinical term for addiction. Just so I don't confuse people. But if somebody with alcohol use disorder goes into a bar, they start to anticipate drinking before they even have their first drink. And they do that because of the cues in the environment, meaning like the sights, sounds, and smells, right? Maybe their drinking buddies are there. Maybe there's the line of bottles above the bar. There's the smell of alcohol, and all those things tell the brain, I'm about to drink. Just like you may know about Pavlov's dog, where it would hear a bell before it was fed in this experiment. And it started to pair hearing the bell with eating. So when it heard the bell, it knew it was going to eat, and it would start to salivate, the dog. So what can parents do to use this information? Well, you can take a look at what's going on inside the home. Are your kids going into a room to do their homework where you have tons of distractions and tons of cues to remind them that it's not time to do homework, but time to game? Right? This was the awful challenge during the pandemic, that parents had to have their kids do school online on the same computer they do their gaming on, which was obviously a disaster for many kids, especially kids with ADHD. Not to mention you had hyperactive kids with ADHD who couldn't sit still, but that's besides the point. So you have this problem of kids having many cues in their environment that it's time to game. Like the problem of having a screen at the dinner table, or having like your phone on the dinner table, or having the phone next to the bed charging. It's there as a cue to the brain, hey, I can get my dopamine hit. And so the further away you can get the dopamine hit from the kid, the more of a delay there is in gratification. So what I like to encourage parents to do, if possible, aside from getting the kids to the outside environment without devices, to the playground or whatever, is I also like to have to try and create like high dopamine and low dopamine zones in the home. So for example, you can have a room where you keep all the devices and they stay charging in there. And for example, if you have a young child, when their block is over, instead of when their block of screen time use is over, instead of the parent having to go and rip the device out of their hands, which does not always go well, instead you're trying to get the child to leave a room, which then gets locked with the devices in it. And in the rest of the house, you have a low dopamine environment, especially hopefully the room they're doing homework or sleeping in. So those are just some examples of how to manage environmental cues. And then another important concept to have balance, I think, is to practice delayed gratification with your kids by alternating high dopamine activities and low dopamine activities. So a good example of this could be you have a system in place where if your child has like half an hour on a screen, they have to take half an hour off a screen, or half an hour in the low dopamine zone, for example. And maybe you have a system of logical and immediate consequences if they're violating that. So maybe if they go 5 minutes over because they're, in the middle of a quest with their friends, which is going to happen, your screen rules are made to be broken. So, but that's fine if you have consistent, regular consequences to that are logical. So, for example, it could be, okay, you went over 5 minutes. Rather than having a power struggle with you and ripping the device from you, let's start the timer, and then we're going to double that time and take it off your next block. Or maybe you get a reward for getting off right when on time to go to bed, or right when your block is over. Maybe there's like an incentive, like because we know positive reinforcement works well, especially in kids with ADHD. So maybe you have a system where for every time they get off on their own at a certain time, they get a little signature on an index card. And when they fill the index card with 5 signatures, they get to redeem it for something they want, right? Just whatever it is, make sure it's not extra screen time. So those are just some ideas. And, when people come see me in my office, I really try to give them very customized approaches that work for their family, because all families are different and all kids are different. So we talked about cues. So this arcade room, like you used to see in the amusement park, that's kind of the model I'm going for, where I say people should have like a high dopamine zone, and then they can have a low dopamine zone, like a room with just board games to play, or puzzles to solve, the old school kind, where you actually have to set them up and put them away when you're done. And they take more patience because of that, or the board games take more patience because you have to wait your turn. Okay, so and then but look at but this is unfortunately the environment that we're all in nowadays, where we just have distractions and cues all the time everywhere we go. Even if we're just standing outside somewhere in public and we see all the other parents on their phone. So those are cues that affect us. Okay, so now that we've sort of covered some things that attract kids with ADHD to screen use problems, let's try to define when it's actually a problem. So the World Health Organization did start recognizing a condition called gaming disorder. And gaming disorder, I wish that they included other problems like social media or streaming videos besides just gaming. Maybe they're getting there. I think they went with what they had the most research on. But gaming disorder is basically defined not by how much you game or how frequently you game, but the problems caused by gaming. In other words, it says impaired control over gaming, increasing priority given to gaming over other activities to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other interests and daily activities, and continuation or escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. So negative consequences are the key to what defines addiction. addiction is really that you have a problem that where you can't stop doing something and it causes problems because you can't stop doing it, such as impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So you can get this definition at the World Health Organization website and read more about it. But the bottom line, the thing to take away about addiction is that it's defined by problems in functioning. In fact, any disorder in psychiatry is really defined by problems in functioning. So, what are some red flags that your kid may be really having a problem? Because really under this definition, you can see addiction as a continuum where you can have mild problems or severe problems, right? So I don't like people to think of addiction as black and white. You're an addict or you're not, because I think that, you can be very addicted or just a little addicted, depending on how well you function. You might make the case that we're all a little addicted, because who hasn't had any problem in their life from being on a screen too long? So the red flags of seeking when it's time to get help, meaning they're seeking screens. Maybe they're aggressive when you tell them it's time to stop. Maybe they're always lying about screen use, and maybe lying about other things as well. And I wouldn't say that like lying about screen use one time is a huge red flag, because most kids have done that. But if it's a really regular, frequent thing to the point that they almost seem to always just have the one thing on their mind, which is to get back on that screen, and will say anything for that to happen. Stealing, when I've seen a lot of cases where kids have stolen thousands of dollars from their parents, to upgrade their video games. Suicidal threats should be taken seriously. If a kid says, even if they say, I'm going to kill myself if you don't give me back my video game, that's a red flag that it's time to get help, and not that it's time to give them back their video game. Especially because these kids with ADHD are impulsive, and they do things that even if it's just a gesture, it can really harm or kill them. So that's another reminder that it's time to get professional help, hopefully from a mental health practitioner who has some experience with this problem. And so now we'll come back to my original point, which is that, kids were coming into my office and the parents were insisting that these other doctors they'd been to before me, or mental health clinicians, that said, okay, if you just treat their ADHD or their anxiety, or their depression, that their gaming would get better. And lo and behold, it hadn't gotten better. And so there's this big debate, right, about chicken or egg. Like what comes first? We know that ADHD is a genetic biological problem, which existed before games got a lot more addictive, right? Although arguably it's gone up since then. But we know that there's a lot of debate over whether gaming a lot can make ADHD worse, right? Cause and effect, right? You could say that it temporarily does because of the condition I described, reward deficiency syndrome. But I'm not going to be one of the people who comes up here and claims that gaming a lot will actually permanently, irreversibly worsen ADHD or cause ADHD in somebody who doesn't have a genetic predisposition for them. I am not going to make that claim at all. All right. However, here's the significance of treating the gaming addiction in someone with ADHD. That the game use is the elephant in the room. And if you don't address it, the other treatments will fail, because you won't have access to the ADHD. You won't have access to the anxiety or the depression. If your kid's on a screen all the time and that's all they're doing and that's all they're thinking about, they're not going to work on executive functioning. Their medication isn't going to help them because they're only taking it during school and not in the evening when they're gaming all night. It's almost like you can't treat these problems without addressing the gaming first. So I didn't see parents coming to me as proof that gaming caused these problems. but rather I saw it as indicating that if we don't address gaming, we aren't able to to address these problems. So that's sort of my take home point, regardless of what causes what. Um, okay. Just a little bit of brief stuff on my treatment model before I turn to questions from all of you. Like if you were to come into my practice and seek my help, or if you were to go into a residential center, I would hope they follow this model in a way too. But for people with severe problems, I'll often take them through a first phase called digital detoxification or dopamine detoxification, where I may have them, go, let's say, a minimum of 3 days without their technology, in order to get back some of these dopamine receptors. Now, this might get them to a point where they're no longer in withdrawal and they're no longer seeking, which makes them much better for the second phase. But it's really important that you follow it with the second phase, because if they come back to the same environment after a detox, they're going to be back where they started. So the second phase is what I call balance through external regulation, meaning that, now that your kid is out of withdrawal, they still need to have a regular system for balancing their screen use that works for them. And now is the time to put it in place, right? And to change the way they approach it. And parents often need to help with that. Or if it's in a residential program, the residential program needs to help them learn that. And unfortunately, a lot of residential programs will do the detoxing part, but they won't allow kids to introduce their screens, and they won't allow kids to learn balance. So they'll go back to the same environment with the screens and not be prepared, and they'll relapse. So it's very important that after a detox, you follow it up with a lot of support. And then, once kids get that through that critical phase, the end goal of treatment, at least by the time kids launch and go off to college or a job, is that they have self-regulation. So these are the phases that I try to take families and kids through. And so a lot of people, especially in talks about ADHD, ask about medication. So I'm going to come back to it from my earlier message that where I described what the mechanism of action of stimulants is, where I was describing how it boosts dopamine release in the brain, and therefore you're getting stimulation from the drug and you don't need it from the screen or from the environment as much. Okay, but the problem with that as a treatment for screen use problems, as I described, is that you're only taking this medication usually during school. And you can't take it at night when kids are having the most gaming problems, because not only will it stop them from eating, it'll stop them from sleeping. And so, those are the known side effects of stimulants. And so we really don't, the first line treatment for the screen use problem itself is usually not medication for me. It's usually a combination of working with parents and psychotherapy. Um, and, you know, I'll have the kids coming into my office often once a week doing psychotherapy, especially the teenagers. And maybe I'll meet with parents online once a month, and we'll talk about some of these ideas of how to strategize changing the home environment, and how to kind of modify and the way the family functions. And so for medication though, what I'll sometimes prescribe is something like bupropion or Wellbutrin, which is known as an antidepressant, but it's also a non-stimulant for ADHD. And it was shown in a trial to reduce gaming problems. It's in a very good study, but there hasn't been enough of them, or with enough subjects, but it's very promising. In fact, bupropion is often used for people to reduce smoking. And then there's another non-stimulant called atomoxetine that's got some research supporting it for gaming problems as well. And there's a lot of experimental drugs that are being used for other addictions right now, but you know, there haven't really been any studies on gaming problems for those other medications because there's some big guns. So in any case, hopefully we'll get there, but for now, the treatments that I use are mostly non-biological. All right, so you can this was a book that I the author passed away, but I was the technical editor of it, and it's got a list of resources in it around the country. This is what my website looks like, cliffordsussmanmd.com. So again, if you click on info, you'll get a lot of information, and you'll get more education. Or if any of the concepts I mentioned tonight didn't make enough sense to you, or you want to learn them in more detail, you might find something in there. Okay, so with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Hello. So
Hi.
there was a great question about, is there any distinction between using social media for gaming versus using social media for social media and texting and really being
Right.
stuck on your screen for those purposes?
Right. So let's think of the brain again as sort of two major functions. There's the the reward pathway functioning, right, which is dopamine release and that's involved in addiction. And then there's like the higher level functionings in the cortex, which are like learning advanced complicated math, for example, or coming up with long-term goals, right? So a lot of technology benefits our higher levels of functioning, which is again why I'm not always like bad mouthing technology. Like there's very great educational software, and there may be a lot of like actual and I sort of talked about some of the not such great advantages to using social media instead of real life socializing, but there may be advantages as well to socializing online. So there, you could argue that there's maybe it helps you keep in touch with old friends, for example, and keep more connections, or meet people out there who are too shy to actually come out in public. So I mean, everything online has a function, right? Whether it's a good one or a bad one, and so these social media applications really do have great functions. It's not like all video games are just violent and made to shoot people, right? But the thing is that's a different thing to look at than how it's actually affecting dopamine and the reward system. And they should be looked at independently, meaning that if you're using social media or you're using a game, right, they both may be releasing the same amount of dopamine in the brain, because remember, that's just based on how instantly you're getting what you want. It doesn't matter what you want, it's how fast you're getting it, right? So there may be completely different benefits on a higher level, like to the cortex, based on whether you're socializing versus gaming. So the answer to that question, if you're looking at the higher level cortex, is like, yes, there's a huge difference, right? It's a completely different function. There's a huge difference between playing an educational video game versus a shoot 'em up game, right? Or looking up something on Wikipedia, but there's not as much of a difference when it comes to the dopamine release. And so it's kind of like you can get too much of a good thing, right? Like you can use it, you can get addicted to an educational game. The fact that it's educational, or the fact that it's social, doesn't prevent you from, having that dopamine release. So that's something to keep in mind, and again, the bottom line is it causing you problems?
Right, exactly. So so when we talk about like phase 2 of or phase 1, now the questions are flowing in.
Yeah.
So the question is,
Well,
how do
good.
you
I'm glad I got people thinking about it,
Awesome.
even if I didn't answer all their questions. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So a question specifically about like physical aggression. How do you set people up to be successful with phase 1, i.e. limiting, screen use when you have a kid who might become physically aggressive in response to you taking away their screens?
That's actually one of my favorite questions. Parents hear about my phase one, the detox phase. Now, remember, if the aggression is that extreme, you may be sending them to a residential program anyway, where they know how to handle that for their detox. And if there's one thing that all residential programs have in common, it's that they detox, even if they're not for screen addiction,
Right. Detox for
but
everything.
yeah,
Actually.
exactly,
Right?
exactly. Right. I mean, I think they're on to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
But 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 people are like, okay, how does that go? You recommending these 3-day detoxes or more as an outpatient psychiatrist. And I want to say that it actually goes much better than phase two, that it's actually much easier than parents think it's going to be. And why is that? I think it's because it's like an out of sight, out of mind thing. I mean, first of all, it's better. It goes better if you go on if you plan like a structured camping trip, let's say, or a vacation, or, at least they have a 9 to 5 thing for those 3 days, so that, like school and after school, so that, that makes the detox a lot easier. Right. But then even without that, detoxing is not as hard as parents think, because, when the aggression happens most often is when you give them access and then take it away. But if you don't give them access in the first place, usually you see less aggression. In fact, it's kind of like you're just keeping them out of the bar instead of letting them go in the bar and having them drink water in the bar, which is where you're going to get the real aggression. So I actually find that parents will come to me. I mean, the first day of a detox, kids can be irritable and bored and complain a lot. I don't see as much aggression as you would think, and not as much as I see when they're not detoxing. And then, like the third day of the detox, which this is why I say minimum of 3 days, is because usually it's day 3 when parents are calling me and being like, Dr. Sussman, you've cured my kid, like they're completely different. They're back to the way they used to behave. They're not, they're being nice again. Like they're actually doing their homework and they're being good to everybody. And it's like, no, I didn't cure them. In fact, if you let them go back to the same activities, they're going to go right back to those old behaviors. But now you've got them where you want them to move them on to phase 2.
Right.
And detoxing can also be used as kind of a reset switch if they do keep relapsing.
Right. So what you're saying is that phase 1, we don't initiate them while they're in the middle of some sort of a gaming tournament or something. You initiate
that would
it while
probably
they're
not be a
at
good
school.
idea.
And when they come home, you're like, hey, guess what? No more screens for a while.
No, I wouldn't surprise them with it. I would maybe talk about it with them, because again, it's better if you plan it coordinated with some structure around it. Like, we're going to go on a camping trip for 3 days and we're going to leave the devices at home, or something like that. We're going to tell everybody that we're not going to be offline, so you can prep them for it. You can tell them it's going to start tomorrow. Like, you don't have to surprise them with it, but yes, I wouldn't start it in the middle of a day, or especially in the middle of a gaming block.
Yeah. Good point. So we have another question here about a woman who's maybe teenager, saves up his screen time. So presumably
Right.
it is limited. So he saves it all
Yeah.
up and then he uses it all in one day.
Yeah.
Pros,
Right.
cons, issues.
Well, it certainly goes against my model of doing alternating blocks, right? But it also encourages binging, right? Because really the bottom line from that model I was showing you is to prevent binging. So it's okay for kids to like have short blocks of screen time if they can actually have them and get off, right? Where you run into trouble is when they don't get off and they just binge, and then it just gets worse and worse. So if you're saving up your screen time and then using it all at once, which based on everything I said would be easier to do anyway, because it's really just a detox followed by a binge, then you're in trouble, because binging is where you get all this, the biological problems going on. And in fact, I've had cases where, like say a kid in college would say to me, oh, this game is coming out, this video game, and it's going to drop, and like I'm going to take off school for a week and I'm going to just play this game all day, every day. And I would say to them something like, well, I expect that you're going to drop out of school. And they'd be like, no, I'll be fine. I'll just get it out of my system. I'll be like, no, you'll drop out of school. And sure enough, they drop out of school like pretty much every time, so binging is very harmful.
Mhm,
That's the bottom line.
mhm. That's helpful to know. Um, so, I mean, here's a question about, I think it sort of gets back to educational gaming versus gaming for social activities versus
Mhm.
gaming purely for games. If your kiddo uses online platforms for creative outlets and those activities are, good activities, they're
Mhm.
learning and they're teaching and
Mhm.
connecting with other people, like, is that
Right.
really make a difference? Does that
I
change
mean,
your
there is
approach?
examples of creative activity you can do online that's lower dopamine, if you think of it as a continuum between high and low dopamine activities. So like if you are, say, writing poetry on Word, or if you're creating a PowerPoint presentation on something, or maybe you are creating content for a game, but you're going into this coding stuff to do it, and you're building it from the ground up with a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. Again, it's all about how much delay and gratification there is. So you can do low dopamine activity on a screen, but I would warn people that it's like drinking water in a bar. So if a kid chooses to use their low dopamine block, like making a video game, let's say, there's a high chance they're going to be like playing other people's games, on whatever platform, or that they're going to be getting distracted or sidetracked by YouTube or whatever. So, a word of caution on using. I mean, sometimes it's easier just to make the low dopamine activities offline. And I mean, one of the questions that a lot of parents ask me is like what to do about having to do schoolwork online. And that is a big problem, because again, it's like drinking water in a bar. And oftentimes some families have had to work things out with teachers to try and get the assignments on paper.
Mhm, mhm. So
Or
this,
maybe having two different devices, like one that's kind of retro, just with a word processor, and then another in the gaming room.
right, which all sort of boils down to an assessment of, is this a low dopamine versus high dopamine activity, which is
Right.
all about instant gratification.
Exactly. And it's
Gotcha.
it's not a perfect system. It's just the best I could come up with. I mean, you're going to find activities where there's gray area. You're not sure whether to consider it a low or high because it's kind of in the middle, right? And there's computer games you can play that are based on things like chess, that take patience. There's real world activities that are based on video game like activities. So really, I mean, and parents, the ones I get asked about the most are like, what about reading ebooks, on Kindle or things like that? And I would say, if you're not sure where to put it, I would just pick one side or the other. And if you put a low dopamine activity, um, or if you put a high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity in low dopamine by mistake, like say they're on their Kindles browsing on a browser on their Kindle, like streaming videos or something like that, if it goes off the rail, you're going to know. Like if it's a high dopamine activity that you accidentally called a low dopamine activity, you're going to find out soon enough because they're going to struggle to get off of it. And so
Right.
parents have to do a lot of like dynamic resetting
Mhm, mhm.
of the system, and the kids have to expect that.
And so that's sort of, I have a lot of behavioral training, so I'm always thinking about like the amount of
Mhm.
reward and whatever.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if low dopamine, or rather, I should say, high dopamine and instant gratification is oftentimes about getting some sort of a response from
Mhm.
whatever you're engaging in. So if
Yeah,
you're doing internet gaming, the amounts of response that you're getting from either other players or from the game is pretty high.
absolutely.
But you're reading a
Yeah.
book, you're not getting a response from anybody. Like it's
Well,
just the
that's true.
content of the book. And so that
Yeah.
might end up meaning it's a more of a low dopamine
Yeah, sure.
activity.
Sure. And then I like to think of like how stimulating is the book? Like, do you have to wait for things to happen? Is it one of those novels with a lot of buildup, or is it like a graphic novel with constant action? I'm really into reading comic books and graphic novels, and I've noticed that like a lot of the modern ones, the action happens a lot faster. Like there's less sort of story between the action. It's almost like one action panel after another. So, it makes me wonder about that. But yeah, I mean, I think of course, there's no perfect way to look at it. But at the end of the day, you want to find a system that works.
Mhm. Okay. So there's a mom who's struggling a little bit because her kid has gotten to the point where he only leaves the home in order to go to school, and the rest of the time he's pretty much on the screen and would refuse to attend in-person therapy. So like the main question is, do you
Look, I mean,
provide
I've seen kids who don't go to school, like who won't leave the home for that. So,
right. So like, what do you do about that? And I think she's specifically asking,
yeah.
do you provide virtual therapy for that? But I think the larger question is,
Mm.
what do you do with that kind of situation?
Yeah.
How do you get your kid
Yeah.
help if that's the
I
case?
mean, there are cases, I'll be honest with you, there are cases like that where I have to refer the parents to, especially if they can't even drag their kid into my office, because, good luck with having them see me on a screen. Like, I mean, I can do the parent interview on a screen virtually, but it's very tough to interview a kid who's addicted to screens on a screen. Talk about drinking water in a bar. But like, so oftentimes I'll say, like maybe they do need to start out with a some kind of detox, or if you can't arrange one outside, you know, through a residential program, or maybe a day program, or if you can get them to one, which is where you're like going to groups all day, and at least you don't have your screens until you come back home in the evening. So yeah, I mean, there's like one of the challenges of any mental health practitioner is figuring out what the appropriate placement is for different cases, and I can't just have every kid who has this problem come right into my office ready to go. Like there's going to be resistance. And what I do is I've been trained in like a type of psychotherapy called motivational interviewing that's designed for people who are resistant to treatment. It was kind of developed for addiction, and so it really it's very effective with like resistant teenagers because it kind of transfers authority from me to them, or from instead of making me an extension of an authority figure, it lets them kind of be their own authority. So instead of them coming in and me saying, you can't do this, it's bad for your brain, it's more like me asking them, what do you think's going on? What do you need? What do you want to get out of your life? Like, what do they're going to be the ones telling me what they should and shouldn't be doing, and I just help them to reach their own goals. So that's like a very abridged version of what motivational interviewing is. And I find that it can help with cases that are pretty resistant to coming in to getting my help. But it's tough if they won't even come in at all, and then there's nothing I can do.
Mhm. Sounds like the detox is pretty critical
Yeah,
with that kind
for some cases, yes, yes.
yeah. So what if you have a college student who really struggles with screen addiction, and they
Yeah.
go away to college and they're surrounded by all of their peers who are constantly using devices and on screens? Do you have any recommendations for that kind of a situation?
Well, this was a big problem even before the pandemic. You know, I think that one tip I give kids going to college is to learn to self-regulate before you go,
Mhm.
and to try and maybe even do a detox right before you get there, so that you're likely or more likely to start off with a good system. Um, so because what I'll see is like they're like, oh, it's my last week to binge on games, the week before they leave for college. And then they're off to a bad start as soon as they get there, and college really is like very tough because of the lack of structure where you do a lot of independent learning.
Mm.
Um, So, and college really isn't for everybody. I think that's also a problem, that a lot of parents send kids to college who really they it may not be the best place for them. They maybe do better at like a 9 to 5 structured job where they always know what they're supposed to be doing. Or if they're in college, they need to be properly medicated, and they need to have a lot of support there, and get in with disability services, and, maybe have support groups that can catch them when they're falling off the rails, but maybe have them, check in with mental health at college. But there's a lot of challenges to college. I mean, I could talk about that for a whole talk.
Mhm, mhm. Gotcha. Do you have any recommendations for places that do the detox that would be like residential?
Yeah. One of the places I really like is called Restart in the Seattle area. And I like it. I mean, I presented with some of the people who run the place, so I know they're good. But I also like it because they do a little bit of reintegration of technology while you're there. It's one of the longer programs, and it's really focused on gaming. So you're not going to get a lot of cases there with other problems, like you might at other centers. And so it's focused on gaming, and B, it really does allow the kids at some point to do some work on a screen, which is unusual for these programs. So kudos to them for that. I mean, all these programs are very expensive, and it's good to have like an advocate who knows about a lot of programs if you're
Yeah.
looking for one.
Yeah. So speaking of phase two,
Mhm.
do you have any recommendations, or are there guidelines out there for what is a reasonable amount of screen time to reintegrate?
Yeah. Well, I don't like to be too uh hard line about like what's the healthy amount of time. Um, like the American Pediatric Association is always changing their mind about like how many hours a day is okay. But again, I think it's more about whether the hours are all in a row, whether you're binging or whether they're spread out. Like I think it's a different effect on the brain if you do 5 hours of gaming separated by 1 hour blocks offline than 5 hours all at once. So uh, it's not just how long you game for, it's how you game. And sometimes like the best thing is to find out what a healthy block length is for your kid rather than a healthy total amount of time in a day. Um, Although it can also be helpful to find out a good cutoff time before bed, because you don't want them gaming too close to when they go to sleep because of not just the blue light, but also the stimulation that they're getting late. So I don't have like a perfect good number of hours in a day, but like but think of my cases. Like oftentimes, if they're adopting this system, they're going from like almost 100% of their free time to like 50%, which is a huge improvement, regardless of
Sure.
whether that should be the goal.
Yeah. How would you assess like the amount of time that's okay versus the amount of time that's really going over the edge and too much? What are the things that you're looking for in your kid to sort of calibrate what's the right amount to be able to
Yeah.
allow before breaks?
Well, I mean, again, it comes down to what problems and what behaviors you're seeing. So, are they able to get off at the end of their blocks? If not, maybe it's too long a block time for them. I mean, maybe you start at like half an hour for like a 7-year-old. Maybe you start at like 45 minutes for an older kid, maybe an hour for for an older teenager. Um, and if that really doesn't work, maybe you've got to shorten the block. And but yeah, the general rule of thumb is that the more time you spend, like the harder it is to get off. And like I've seen people work out systems where maybe the parents can't be too rigid about it because of the child they have. Maybe they have to give them up to 2 hours, let's say. But if they don't use all the time, then don't have to wait as long for the next block. So like if they only use an hour and a half of the 2 hours, then they only have to wait an hour and a half. And they have to figure it out so that they're done on time in time for bed, or whenever the cutoff time is. So look, I mean, again, a lot of these are done through just parents trying different systems to figure out what works, just using sort of my general principles in mind. And I do a lot of like very customized work with families.
Gotcha. I think that we covered all of the questions, but I could have missed something. So if people could write in the chat if I did miss something. We're coming up on 9 o'clock, which is our usual sort of cutoff time. I'm just cruising through the chat to make sure that I didn't miss things. No, I think that we covered everything here.
Great.
Pam, did you want to pop back on to say goodbye? Let us know what the next thing is, because I think we might be taking a break for the summer. Is that true?
Yes, in fact, this is the last lecture for this spring session, and we're taking a hiatus in the summer and returning back in either August or September with more exciting lectures related to our ADHD community. Thank you so much, Terry. You did a great job of fielding all these questions. And Dr. Sussman, can't thank you enough for everything that you've provided. This is an incredibly important and touches every family across the country as far as the screen time and what is appropriate and how to get our kids off screens and get them back in the real world. And what's fair and what is healthy. So I'm just so appreciative of your expertise. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. And we look forward to promoting the fall lecture series after the summer. Have a wonderful summer, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, Dr. Sussman.